Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Turk. I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel discussion. We do have some clipboards here. If any of you aren't on our mailing list or email list for any events, we'll pass this around. You can just add your name and email address. We won't swamp you with emails. We have typically about 12 panels a year, and we also have a film series on the second Tuesday of every month. And this year's film series is on the topic of disinformation. And the film, appropriately enough, given tonight's session, that's going to be next. The film is next Tuesday night at 7 p.m. is entitled "The Great Hack." It's about Cambridge Analytica. It came out last year. It's actually quite a good film. So if you haven't seen it, you can go on our website and see the details. It's next Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at the School of Image Arts. There's a theater there, room 307. Tonight, as you know, we're going to be talking about can social media hate, lies, and harassment be regulated, and how? From fake news and malignant disinformation to bullying, death threats, trolling, sexual extortion, stalking, tormenting. The wonderful potential of social media has clearly a dangerous and dark side that disproportionately affects women and those from marginalized communities. Solutions, it seems, and we're going to explore that tonight, seem elusive, given social media's anonymity, its permanence of its record, the claim that once it's on the internet, it's there forever, and the capacity of cyber abuse to go viral. There's no shortage of demands from the public and others to do something from politicians, and there's no shortage of suggestions as to what to do. So we're going to dig into that tonight. We have two panelists who are quite, I think, remarkable and should shed a lot of light on some of these questions. Mathen, do you want to come up, Carissima? Is a professor of law at the University of Ottawa. She's an expert in constitutional law, is a widely published scholar and a frequent legal commentator. She's the former director of litigation for the Women's Legal Education Action Fund, LEAF, in which role she litigated equality rights cases before the Supreme Court of Canada. Her last book is entitled Courts Without Cases, The Law and Politics of Advisory Opinions, which was published last year. And she has a new book that will be coming out shortly called The 10th Justice, Martin Edon, Judicial Appointments in the Supreme Court Act Reference. I heard her present a superb talk at a conference, was it in October, I think, at the University of Waterloo. And her talk was entitled Regulating Expression on Social Media, which is our topic for tonight. Carissima received her Master's of Law from Columbia University, her Bachelor of Laws from Osgoode Hall, and her BA in Philosophy and Political Science from McGill. So welcome, Carissima. We're glad you could be with us. Our second panelist is Ravi Vatrapu. He's the Loretta Rogers. Now, your title and where you are, it's very long, so I'll say it all. The Loretta Rogers Research Chair in Digital Enterprise and Professor of Computational Social Science at the Department of Information Technology and Management of the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson. A real mouthful. So, come on up. He was formerly a professor of computational social science in the Department of Digitalization at the Copenhagen Business School, and he traded Copenhagen for Toronto to be with us at Ryerson. He was also formerly a professor of applied computing at Christiania University College and the founding director of the Center for Business Data Analytics. Ravi's current research focus is on big social data analytics to design, develop, and evaluate a new holistic approach to computational social science, social set analytics. Ravi recently served as the spokesperson for the sounding board for the Multi-Taskholder Forum on Disinformation, set up by the European Commission. The sounding board provided advice to the world's first ever self-regulation the Code of Practice on Online Disinformation. The sounding board consists of representatives of the media, civil society, fact checkers, and academics, and it continues to be engaged with the efficacy and effectiveness of the Code of Practice on Online Disinformation. Ravi has a PhD in Communication and Information Sciences from the University of Hawaii, a graduate certificate in International Cultural Studies from East West Center, a Master of Science in Computer Science and Applications from Virginia Tech, and a Bachelor of Technology in Computer Science and Systems Engineering from Andhra University in India. So we're delighted you could be with us tonight. Now, can I get you to shift over here if you don't mind? All these mics are tagged to certain chairs, so I've got to sit over there. Unless you want to moderate, but I don't know enough about this to be a panelist, so there we go.
That's clearly not true.
So I'd like to set the context a little bit for our discussion. I mean, the first thing is where to start a discussion about how to regulate social media. I just looked in the last day at some of the headlines. I mean, one was conservatives spread false claim on Twitter about electoral fraud as Iowans prepare to caucus. Now, the Iowans had other problems after they caucused, but so just before they started caucusing, Republican operatives put out on social media the following claim: 8 Iowa counties have more voter registrations than citizens old enough to register. Totally false, but went viral. There were complaints to Twitter. Twitter's response was, quote, "The tweet you referenced is not in violation of our election integrity policy, as it does not suppress voter turnout or mislead people about when, where, and how to vote," end quote. Or another headline: Stephen King quits Facebook over false claims in political ads. So he decided that since Facebook wasn't fact-checking political ads, he was going to have nothing more to do with them. And the example he cited was Facebook's refusal to remove a 30-second video that falsely claimed that Joe Biden promised Ukraine $1 billion if they fired the prosecutor investigating the company at which his son was on the board. And we know, when you think of the allegations of bad behavior, I mean, I could go on at some length. I talked about the next film in our series next Tuesday, which is about Cambridge Analytica. I mean, Facebook was fully aware in 2015 that Cambridge Analytica and other companies had gained access to detailed personal information about millions of Facebook users. And they kept the knowledge to themselves and then threatened to sue The Guardian when it broke the story. Or in Nigeria, Facebook, in a number of developing countries, Facebook is pushing its app as the gateway to the internet for new smartphone users. In Nigeria, it set off a tsunami of fake news and hate speech that led to a number of murders. They were under a lot of pressure. They denied it first, and then they finally said, well, we're going to fix this. And so what they've done is they've set up digital literacy programs in 140 secondary schools. And in Nigeria, 140 secondary schools is less than 1% of the schools. There's also the financial, I don't know if we're going to talk about that tonight, the financial side of social media. At the moment, Facebook and Google are grabbing an estimated 58% of the US digital ad market, with Microsoft and Amazon and their equivalents gathering up almost all the rest. As one observer said, what's left for the conventional media is almost a rounding error. And that's having a devastating effect on conventional media. Today, there are less than half the number of journalists there were 20 years ago in the United States and Canada working for traditional media. And many of them are unsure of their future. You look at what happened. I mean, there's towns like Guelph that don't even have a newspaper anymore. It went under because it just wasn't financially viable. As well, the media that survive are dependent on the whims of the social media company decisions. So when Zuckerberg announced in 2014 that he was aware of the problems for the conventional news media, they were going to change the Facebook algorithm to privilege media or content that came from the news media. And the result was dramatic. There was a huge spike for almost all the media in North America in attention they got because of the change in Facebook's algorithm, directing more to them. And then in 2018, Facebook changed its policy back, so it giving greater preference to friends as opposed to news media, and it dropped. There's one, I just brought it along as an example, one little American publication I like called Mother Jones, a good progressive magazine. In 2014, when Zuckerberg changed the Facebook algorithm, the number of article views went from that they got through Facebook went from 1.5 million to more than 5 million. I mean, a huge increase. And when he changed it back in 2018, it dropped down below where it had been previously. And all the news media are not supposed to release the analytics. A few have done so, and the consequences have been quite serious. So what do we do about all this? I mean, this is one of the things we're going to talk about. And there have been a number of observations about what to be done. One is self-regulation. We'll talk a bit about that. A book, if you haven't read it, I'm bringing along a little library tonight. One of the early investors in Facebook, and one of the ones who really started getting it was Roger Back-to-Me. And he has come to a different view of things now in his book called Zucked. Gives you a clue as to what the book may be about. And he presents a fairly strong case that Facebook and Google have actually failed at self-regulation. Another really good book on some of these things is by Siva Vaidyanathan, who's a professor of law at the University of Virginia. It's called Anti-Social Media. And it's very critical of Facebook. He's an inveterate Facebook user, he admits. But he said, the problem is the business model of Facebook and other social media platforms is to keep eyes on the page. And the way we keep eyes on the page is not by having nuanced, thoughtful content, but by having dramatic things that cause fear, that cause anxiety, that spring emotions, and they're unlikely to limit that because that's what makes their business model possible. Or a second solution is suggestion of state regulation to have these platforms censor inappropriate material. And there have been, presumably the panel may talk about some of these examples of Facebook dealing with hate speech, or Twitter. And that raises the questions: A, are they good at it? Can they do that with their business models? B, do we want private business corporations being censors of what the public can see and not see? And even if they do censor and it comes off Facebook and Twitter and so forth, it goes to 4chan or the successor of 8chan or Reddit, does it ever go away? Or a third is encouraging new competitors, encouraging the business sector innovators. Ryerson's big on the innovation business. But can new would-be competitors have a chance in taking on Facebook or Google or Amazon, who've constructed protective moats around their business to exploit network effects and intellectual property to seriously limit the ability of startups to access users and generate value from advertising? And some, like McNamee and others, suggest, well, we have to look at what happened 100 years ago or 90 years ago when they had to break up the big petroleum trusts, Standard Oil and so forth. And do we need to bring in antitrust legislation to break up these monopolies? But does this have a chance of being successful? Facebook, to some extent, has already started anticipating that by integrating Instagram and WhatsApp so that it would be hard to break them apart. And then, do the data protection laws in the EU offer some options that we should look at? And we have a person who's quite knowledgeable about that on our panel, so we'll consider that. A final thing I would say is there's a lot of temptation to say all this is because of social media. all these hate speech, fake news, this is all simply an artifact of social media. It's a new phenomenon. And it's absolutely not the case. A wonderful book that I'd recommend for any of you to have a look at is by a University of Pennsylvania historian named Sophia Rosenfeld. It's called Democracy and Truth. And she points out, and I'll just quote, real fake news, it turns out, is a very old phenomenon. Pornographic libels featuring a sex-obsessed Marie Antoinette in the years before the French Revolution are simply ancestors of today's news stories claiming Michelle Obama or Melania Trump is actually a man or a body double or a lesbian. Conspiracy theories starring Jews have been a media staple from the Middle Ages to, well, the age of George Soros today. Or even with regard to Donald Trump, she reminds us that in 1796, at the end of his presidency, George Washington, in a passage that now sounds remarkably familiar, wrote about the newspapers and gazettes of his day that they, quote, this is George Washington, teemed with all the invective that disappointment, ignorance of facts, and malicious falsehoods could invent to misrepresent my politics and affections, to wound my reputation and feelings, and to weaken, if not entirely destroy, the confidence that you, the public, have placed in repose to me. Anyways, so the change, I mean, what I think the last piece of context I want to say is the change with social media is the amplification of disinformation, not that disinformation is something new. The fact, though, is how we communicate with each other has changed profoundly over the last number of years with the rise and enormous power of the social media platforms. So our panel is going to discuss, this is sort of background, we'll discuss some of the things, not others. So I want to begin by asking Carissima, first, how she sees our society dealing with the range of challenges like these, given our longstanding recognition of freedom of expression. You know, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes freedom of expression as one of our 4 fundamental freedoms. So could you begin by talking about that a bit?
Sure, and thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here tonight to talk about this issue. I often have felt in the last few months that I'm sort of venting into the void when I talk about freedom of expression, because it almost seems to have become a bit of a dirty word in some circles, but I am an unabashed fan, so I'll put those cards on the table to start. So I think it's important to recognize that, you know, we often compare ourselves to the US, unfortunately, and you know, we say, well, we don't have the same kind of tradition as the US does in terms of its respect for free speech, which is the term that we use in the American constitutional context. You know, that's not really true. We've had respect and we've valued freedom of expression for centuries. Certainly in the British constitutional tradition, that was a fact. And you can go all the way back to early 20th century case law, where the Supreme Court, in the absence of a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights as we have now, nonetheless found ways to ensure that laws that were very detrimental to fundamental freedoms were found to be unlawful. So we've had that commitment to freedom of expression for almost 100 years. It's now firmly entrenched in our Constitution, but it is true that unlike the American Constitution, our charter has a provision that allows for what are called reasonable limits on all of the rights and freedoms guaranteed in the charter. So you cannot, for example, in Canada, advocate for an absolutist approach to freedom of expression. As long as something counts as expression, the state can't do anything about it. Our expression is subject to reasonable limits, and that's why, for example, in our criminal code, we have a law that makes it a crime to willfully promote hatred against identifiable groups. A law like that in the American context would almost certainly be unconstitutional because of the First Amendment. So we do have some limits, but they're not as extensive as people seem to assume in the Canadian context. And what I would say as to how well we're navigating the situation now is what I've always thought in terms of our commitment to these fundamental values, which are so important, is that to a large extent, we've been lucky in having political actors who, for the most part, have also accepted those values, right? And who have not really questioned the importance of, for example, freedom of expression. And what I'm sensing now is less of that commitment, either in the sense of maybe paying lip service to it. It kind of becomes an aside. It might be a single line in, a 400-page report on the future of broadcasting, or it's not mentioned at all. And in this sense, I think that we are a little bit different from the American context in that while Canadians in general are extremely committed to their charter rights and really value the constitutional rights that they have, there isn't, I find, as aggressive a sense of ownership over those rights. And so I worry sometimes that there's a bit of a passiveness in terms of how the debate takes shape, and I'm worried that we're not seeing enough of a firm position staked out in terms of the importance, this fundamental importance of freedom of expression, and that it is precisely in these times when the scale is overwhelming. You spoke of disinformation. There's also other negative kinds of expression that we find on social media in society in general. That's where we have to hold the strongest, right? We have to really cleave to those principles when it's the most difficult.
Okay. Well, we'll dig into that a little bit more. Ravi, you've done research on disinformation and fake news, I understand. Our discussion so far has taken for granted the serious societal consequences of social media's remarkable ability to disseminate such content on a scale that was unimaginable in most of our history. I mean, in fact, unimaginable not very long ago. But does research confirm the conventional wisdom about the societally devastating effects of so-called disinformation? What are you finding?
First of all, thank you, Jim, for having me, having both of us here. Thanks for being here. It's late in the evening. I think regarding, so we have, so far, if you look at the state of art in terms of published research on technical research on the impact of disinformation on outcomes like the US election or Brexit or the Italian election or whatever that might be. Let's stick to electoral outcomes. We do not have concrete evidence. What we have does indicate that there is a role for particularly if you look at the US election 2016, that there has been an exposure to the voting age population, to Facebook ads, and so on and so forth. But if you're a political scientist, maybe you want an answer to a question like, to what extent is the voting age population for US election 2016 exposed to fake news, right? Disinformation on Facebook, Twitter, and what if any is the impact of it? Is it 1%? Is it 2%? Is it 0.05%? Right, where you were going to vote for Hillary, and then you saw a fake news item on Facebook, and then you decided to vote for Donald Trump. So this ad has this magical power of changing the electoral outcome or vice versa. We do not have evidence for that. We have some indirect pieces of evidence, and it's a very problematic issue because. Without evidence, it's hard to inform policy. If we go by, even The Great Hack is a fantastic documentary, but if you also look at how Cambridge Analytica has been covered in the popular press, it's basically tech journalists not being incompetent. Sorry for being provocative. I mean, they simply don't read research. Maybe they're way out of their depth, technically speaking, and they go by, I'm going to go on a bit on a rant and I'll come back. You have this.
Go ahead.
you have this Cambridge Analytica CEO, claiming all kinds of things. We made this, we can do this, we can do that. But when we look at published research on similar behavioral changes in viral product design, in social product design, in public health cases, we don't find such large effects. We find very small effects in real-world field experiments, right? When you show in control field experiments online, we don't really see large effects. We see very small effects. They're significant here and there, but it's not like something, world domination from those effects is kind of, but that seems to be washed away, and all we have is the word of a Etonian, right? Why would they lie? Why would the CEO of Cambridge Analytica lie about the efficacy of their software? So there is a question there whether is it really that powerful? Maybe it is, but we need some evidence. So that's one part of it. I think the second side to that is, and this is where the big tech needs to be blamed 100%. They don't provide the data. So we have a situation where you might want to do research on it. There might be an enterprising PhD student, and she might want to do research, settle this question forever using empirical evidence, but it's not possible because the data is not available. And then you get all kinds of excuses, right, like GDPR and this and that, which is completely, it's our algorithms are intellectual property, this and that. This is, so I think we'll go more into that, but we have, to sum it up then, I think we have two issues, right? Whatever research we have that is published is, we do not have a strong consensus. It's nowhere near climate science or even like tobacco and cancer. Right? That debate has been settled, even though there was large disagreements initially. We are not in a position to empirically settle the discussion that fake news was statistically significant in changing electoral outcomes. Maybe for US 16, the problem is really Fox News, right? And New York Times, writing 2,560 articles about emails of Hillary Clinton and maybe James Comey letter. If you're thinking of that electoral outcome, and what role did fake news have in that outcome, we cannot conclude with a large degree of confidence, right? Because the evidence is not there. I'm not saying we can't do that, right, but we are not there yet. And then the tech platforms are not helping, right? They have completely shut off data, or they give it to you if you have a special agreement with them. And they give cleaned data sets, but it's not something, that's science cannot thrive on privileged data sets that are given to a chosen few. When Mark Zuckerberg, in his infinite generosity decides to give,
Well, do they not give it because they actually have no financial interest in that research being done? Because they lose either way. If the research shows that the fake news, the disinformation has this massive negative impact, then the pressure on them to do something about it would be enormous. And if it shows that it has no impact, why are people going to pay for their services?
That's a problem for a publicly listed company, right? Either way, you're doomed. If it shows that it has a very large impact, maybe some regulators will come after you, if not the US, the EU. If it shows there is negligible impact, why are all these digital marketeers bothering with your platform, right?
Right.
So you have you might have a problem there. But right now there is no access. Right now there is no access to data.
Well, I just think we have to be careful about what the money is being made on. The money is being made on basic advertising,
Right.
not on convincing voters one way or another. That's why certain outfits might seek to use the technology powered by the platforms, but the business model remains, and I think the reason they don't give it is it's proprietary, and they're extremely sensitive about revealing that just in a business sense.
Well, and they are extremely proprietary. We have no clue how their algorithm works.
Because they have ownership over the.
That's right.
Over this entire landscape.
So then the question becomes, as you rightly pointed out, it's not just about disinformation or misinformation, but there's all sorts of cyberbullying. There's we have We have women journalists like Paula Todd who've written about how they get besieged with horrific trolling and so forth. They cover a story in a certain way. Or Marie Heenan, who represented John Gomeshi, who's a feminist lawyer, but nevertheless feels everybody has a right to be defended, has just been subjected to horrific stuff. Or when the city librarian in Toronto, Vickery Bowles, the library, as is its policy, will rent space to anybody in the community as long as they're not going to engage in illegal activity. Rented space to Megan Murphy, and she became, I mean, I just saw some of the email and social media that she received. It was just disgusting. So there is a social problem of some sort, whether it influences elections or not. It really interferes with people's ability to live their lives or to carry out their jobs. A number of people have given up being journalists. Women have given up being journalists because of these kinds of pressures. So one of the key questions is, what can we do about it? And is there a way to do something about it that doesn't threaten our principles and commitment to freedom of expression? Now, the European Commission has explored various ways of encouraging self-regulation. Could you talk a little bit about those?
Yes. So what the European Commission has two problems, right? One is, of course, you can say it's a foreign policy problem with Russia as an actor that they don't like, particularly in some spheres. And then they have a tax problem because none of the big tech companies are based in Europe, and they have double Irish and double Luxembourg tax treaties, so they're hardly anything. So these two are tied together because you have anti-competition fines and other things, on big tech, and then you have the propaganda, the computational propaganda or disinformation line of inquiry, and these are two different directorates of the commission, right? So the DG Connect or the Digital Connect Directorate decided to do something about disinformation. So using the convening powers that the commission has, they set up a high-level commission consisting of academics, multiple stakeholders, right? Big tech representatives, advertisers, public-private broadcasters, print, independent fact-checkers, radio, and so on and so forth. And there were 9 objectives that came out of that. There was a communication. There were 9 objectives that came out of it. And then there was a multi-stakeholder forum on disinformation that was set up. And it consists of 2 bodies. One is the working group, which is all the big tech and their advertisers. And they were supposed to draft a code of practice, a self-regulatory code of practice against these 9 objectives that were laid out in the official communication. And then the rest of us, which is all the broadcasters, private, public, TV, print, news, independent fact checkers, and academics, we were part of a sounding board. We were all in the same room, and we would provide constructive feedback on the code of practice. So we issued so the code of practice was finally published. We issued a damning public condemnation of this code of practice. The sounding board had 2 issues, or 3 issues, but 2 large ones. The first one is a minor technical point, which is the code of practice is not actually a code of practice. The commission has a definition for what a code of practice should entail, and it doesn't really follow that definition. But of course, the commission decided to sign off on it, right, with the big tech platforms. There's a small problem there, you could say. But the other 2 are major concerns. There are no clear objectives. So a lot of it is we shall remove bots, right? Which is an ongoing activity. We do not know how this removal of bots is tied to disinformation, and what, if any, is the link, right? So, and you get very vague metrics, and you do not get any clear commitment of resources. How many full-time equivalents? What is the resource allocation for combating disinformation? We don't get any. So there are no clear objectives. The metrics are vague, and then you don't get any resource commitment. And the problem there in that case is it's amazing how big tech can get away by saying, oh, when it comes to metrics, in this area, we don't have the skills, we don't know how we can measure it, which is like, come on, I mean, this is, yeah, but it's a fantastic thing to get away with, right? I mean, to even make this claim that, oh, everything is intellectual property, we have fantastic algorithms, they're intellectual property, but we cannot really do much about how to measure, the outcomes of those algorithms because, that's, yeah, we can't go there. So the code is under assessment now. The test case for the code was the European elections. We have a new commission, and the new commission has its task cut out in terms of there will be a formal evaluation report coming out from the commission, and then the commission has to decide on whether it's going to be self-regulation, co-regulation, or a vertical or horizontal sectorial regulation. And they do have good examples of regulating. There is a European regulatory body, right, for broadcasters and so on. So they do have expertise in. It's one thing that you can't blame the commission for lacking, right? I mean, they might not have a lot of political legitimacy, but they have a lot of technocrats. I mean, they know their regulation. Can't blame the commission for lack of technical, competencies. But it's also a new area for them, and we'll see what will come out of it, right? But let's not, if you're being cynical, you could also say this disinformation is coming out of DG Connect, but there is anti-competition inquiry into big tech in Europe. So maybe there will be a happy compromise somewhere, right? If you're, which might mean that disinformation gets pushed out. So that's
when I looked at the European Union Code of Practice on Disinformation, it defines disinformation. I'll just read it to you. Disinformation as, quote, verifiably false or misleading information which cumulatively is created, presented, and disseminated for economic gain or to intentionally deceive the public and may cause public harm. And then it says, the notion of disinformation does not include misleading advertising. And I think what I just read was a definition of misleading advertising.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's, the contradiction there just strikes me as this is a really fraught enterprise for some of the reasons you mentioned. And Carissima, another one is, presumably it's asking Facebook and Twitter to censor themselves, or to be the censor of not allowing certain things. And what issues do you see calling for private corporations to be censors of public access to information?
Well, in one sense, they already do that in that they have codes of conduct for their users that over time have become more fleshed out and have become more assertively enforced. I think the most dramatic turnaround has probably been that of Twitter, which was the most absolutist, was actually founded on the idea, we just allow people to put the ideas out there. And the more provocative, the more inflammatory even, the better. And it was actually when there were ISIS beheadings being linked to or being posted on Twitter that they finally, I think for the first time, were willing to remove content. But that was a while ago. And that was still the exceptional example. And now you have them essentially having certain standards. One of them, for example, is around misuse of pronouns to protect persons who have a different gender identity of some kind. And so a number of people they're just banned for that. If you're getting away from just the kind of content that could get you banned and just the actual problems with the content that you might want to address, I think we have to keep in mind just the scale of information that is being posted and circulated and viewed on these websites. So it's in the hundreds of millions of individual posts a day on some of these worldwide platforms. And so you are going to have a large, either like if the incentives are serious enough, particularly like financially or so forth, you're going to have very aggressive policing of those boundaries because they won't want to risk the financial penalty. And so, ironically, you'll have more aggressive policing of content, of expression, than you ever would by the state, which is, very content to just sort of do a piecemeal enforcement. If you think of criminal law, like we don't have it in our minds that we're going to actually prosecute every crime that's committed in society. Like the society would not be livable if that were it would become an absolute police state. But tech companies that have, in a sense, a smaller universe to police, I mean, they would be quite comfortable with sort of trying to achieve that sort of 100% compliance, especially with some of the European models, for example, that are imposing very significant financial penalties for material. I think at one point it was if it was on the platform for more than an hour, and I believe the German model is still 24 hours. If you map that onto the amount of the volume of information you're having to police, either they're going to be extremely aggressive or to just have sort of ex-ante type of moderation, which is not, would clearly not be serving the kind of platform that they want to do. The other thing that happens in these environments, which are so polarized, is that there's great suspicion and there's an assumption that everyone is operating in bad faith. So you're being subjected, or your speech, your expression is being subjected to overzealous policing, but a rival or someone who's articulating ideas that you find highly offensive, you might think is not. And so there's an enormous lack of trust that is created, and a tendency to want to really want to monitor every single thing that's going on, or taking one example because things do slip by and saying, aha, this shows that the entire endeavor is just a sham. So what we have seen, though, is that because for the most part, highly developed societies, democracies, governments don't want to actually have to police the content themselves. They're outsourcing it onto the platforms. The platforms do not operate with the same sort of values and the same sense of the public interest that state actors at least could be expected to. And so we shouldn't expect them to be looking for anything other than the most efficient, the most risk-averse, the most conservative, and I just mean in the small c conservative, and the most, in a sense, the most blanket policy that they can possibly come up with.
But in your description of what, and I agree completely with your last characterization, that they'll be looking for the most efficient, most risk-averse, most aggressive, are in some ways fundamentally the opposite. I mean, with regard to policing expression, are the exact opposite of the values reflected in our charter or in the U.S. First Amendment, which values especially political discourse, but speech or expression generally, so much that it's only, in Canada, a very high bar before it's disallowed. We're creating a system by outsourcing it to the platforms, where they have every incentive to do, just as you were saying, be very aggressive. And doesn't that put us in a position where the very kind of speech that's necessary in a democratic society is being overly broadly restricted because of the desire or the need to get at some of the bad actors?
It does, it absolutely does. And part of the reason that this is happening as well is that the platforms aren't subject to the same obligations as the state. So they're not bound by the charter guarantee of freedom of expression. That's something that the government owes to you, to us. It's not something that private actors owe to us. But the reality, of course, is that much of our democratic discourse is taking place on these platforms that are owned by third parties, by private parties. And so, and I think that that in itself is something we can talk about. Like I think that's just a reality that we're probably not going to get away from. We're probably not going to be able to reverse. But that, it sort of compounds it because a lot of the expression is taking place in this arena, but the actors aren't subject to the same sorts of expectations. And I just wanted to ask, and before we go any further, I know we don't have that many people here, but or don't have a representative sample. How many people would consider themselves to be active users of social media? So a healthy sample, but not that many. How many people are regularly on Twitter? Okay, yeah. Twitter, one of the things that makes, so we often hear, we're hearing it now in the American context, when we talk about like sort of the current primaries and so forth, that Twitter is not very representative of the actual voters, for example. It's very small. But one of the things that makes Twitter have this outsized presence is all of the journalists are on Twitter.
As is the President of the United States.
As is the President of the United States, fair enough. But I mean, so it gives Twitter sort of really amplified and in some ways I would say misleading or unfortunate promise.
Well, certainly compared to Facebook's impact.
Yes.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yep.
But if the pressure, I mean, if the public sense and the politician's sense of the harm, whether there's evidence for it or not, that's harm that's being caused, and so the pressure is on them to do something.
Yeah.
But the scale, I mean, how many hundreds of millions of Facebook posts are there a day? How many tens of millions of new YouTube videos go up every hour? So if the platforms are feeling the need or the obligation to police this, and if Germany has laws that it can only be up for 24 hours, or others have laws of a lesser period. And remember too, we're talking about content in maybe 400 languages. So you have that additional complication.
And we're forgetting about half the world that doesn't actually use Western platforms, right?
Right.
Like billions upon billions of people are,
Yeah.
but we don't care about that because,
Well, but Facebook does that. I mean, that's why Facebook is trying to have its app, or Google, I mean, they're trying to use their apps to have, Facebook in particular, a way into the internet without having to go through the official internet. But my point is, the scale in which they have to operate and the difficulty of the problems of policing expression, it seems to me inevitably leads, and I don't know, Ravi, if you have some sense of this, leads to the use of artificial intelligence or other means to do this because humans can't possibly do it. Facebook couldn't hire enough monitors, or Google couldn't hire enough monitors to find all these things. And then it has to do with how the AI is set up and so forth, and what it captures and what it doesn't capture.
Yeah, I think in one sense that's the headache, right? I mean, if there is, let's say hypothetically there is regulation and corporate compliance should be the responsibility of the platforms. How they go about it is should be a cost that of course they can offload that cost onto advertisers or others. I think in so far I think we kind of discuss it under the free press, freedom of speech, freedom of expression lens, but I think there's also maybe a different frame available to public authorities, which might be a frame, a regulatory frame from other industry sectors, like public health, for example, or big pharma.
Could you elaborate on that a bit?
So one analogy I would like to draw is, so the current state of matters is a bit like, imagine this is the 1960s, right? Late 50s, 80s. You have this big debate going on about the link between lung cancer and smoking. And if you look at those debates, there are many actually, some of the founding parents of statistics like Sir Roland Fisher did not agree that it was a causal link. So there's huge debates that the link was, correlational, not causation, right? You might have a gene that might predispose you to smoking, the same gene might predispose you towards lung cancer, and what you're seeing is a correlation. You're not getting cancer because you're smoking, right? But those, so in that case, I mean, there was solid epidemiological work. The reason it happened is the big tobacco did not own the doctors. It did not own the patients. It did not own the data about the patients. So what you have right now is big tech has the user, the consumer, the advertisers, the data, everything. So nothing comes out of what happened in the Facebook world stays in the Facebook world. So you cannot do, if you want to do, if you're a political scientist or, or any other kinds of science with the large amounts of data, you can't do much. And at the same time, you have a claim that what we do is very complex and complicated intellectual property. Everything is a trade secret. We will not allow a pharmaceutical company to get away with that argument. Pharmaceutical molecules are much more complex than algorithms in many cases because they have to really worry about interaction effects, side effects, and it's literally life and death in quite a few cases. And you have a good regulatory regime. I mean, we still can assess the effect of a new drug without compromising the intellectual property or damaging the innovation process. And in some countries, you can also regulate the price for it. That's a different topic. So maybe we need to move to a model where it will allow us to not so much call for algorithmic transparency. I think that's where I think the debate on the research side and also on the public discourse has been a bit wrong. I mean, who cares about what algorithmic transparency? What we should care about is what an algorithm does to the public. That's where you can measure public harm. If your platform is causing epidemics of measles because you're serving anti-vaxxers, that's a public health problem, and they should be, it should come under, it's causing public harm, and it should be maybe, pulled under that. It cannot be, so if we treat it like big pharma or other industry sectors, we just don't let factories, maybe we do these days, pollute whatever, or put whatever they want into our rivers and lakes and into air. Maybe, maybe they can still do that south of the border, but maybe not in some other parts of the world. So I think the public sphere, free speech, free expression is one angle, but there's also a way to there should be a way to quantify public hazard or public harm in different fields, because Facebook is not only a problem for academics in political science or other fields. It's also a problem. It's a real big problem if you're a public health official. We recently had a new vaccine introduced in Denmark, and public health had to fight with and over social media platforms, because all of the it's a very costly public health intervention, and it's all going the
And we're
wrong
seeing
way.
some of that around the coronavirus, and a lot of the information that's being put out about that now.
So that's so I think in there could be other there could be other ways of, again, I'm not a constitutional law expert or a policy expert, but I think the problem we have right now is we cannot make any headway about calculating that public harm, public hazard, establishing that causal link. If we have if during an election campaign, if you have if 20% of your Facebook feed is made up of false advertising or misleading advertising or content, then it is highly likely that it will affect the outcome of your decision, in 2% of the cases or 3% of the cases, and it might be enough to, so that we don't have. It's not like we cannot have it.
No, so I mean, that's the question. Did you have something you want to say first?
Well, I would just wanted to, I guess the other side of it, and to be a little bit provocative, is the other thing that is never discussed or is very rarely discussed is the enormous value that the platforms put out there in terms of technological capability, right? Search, email, maps, just general information. Forget about talking to your friends. I mean, just the way that we navigate the world. And this makes the competition law argument, which is the other way, let's go look at another sector, makes it tricky, because the notion of what is protecting the consumer and what is the consumer actually experiencing in terms of detriments and benefits is complicated. And the state clearly is not prepared, or doesn't seem to be prepared, to offer the same infrastructure, right, as a public service, so that we could, in fact, enjoy a number of those benefits, which we now expect. We expect to be able to use the internet in a particular way, and I think we all have to sort of be real with ourselves that is the universe in which we live. And so that makes the competition law aspect, the antitrust argument tricky, and it's also what they call the network effect. Like the larger the capability, the more valuable it is to the end user. Which, let's just break it up. Well, maybe in terms of some of the purely social ones, okay, although still you wouldn't want to necessarily be on a different Facebook from your family in India, for example. But it's the other stuff, the non-social interaction that would be, I think, highly detrimentally affected if we were to try and apply a monopolistic model to the technology.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
And maybe
I have a question
one
for you.
thing to add to what Carissima said is also, I think there's the other, of course, we need to take into account all the good that comes with the bad, right? I mean, that's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be made, and we need to be realistic about it. And also provocatively, then, what about the public? We seem to assume that the public is, consists of altruistic do-gooders, and but in this era of hyper-partisanship, many of the positions are ideological, right? Maybe the case is that there is a significant proportion of the general public that really does not like traditional media or mainstream media, or whichever way you want to put it, and sees social media as speaking the truth or politically convenient for it, right? At least in Europe, you could say disinformation is not a politically neutral term. Certain populistic far-right parties, populistic if you're being kind, far-right if one is being more honest, do seem to have a great love for social media, and actually will argue that disinformation is not actually disinformation. So it's a politically contested, it's a politically contested.
Well, I mean, it's true. One person's disinformation can be another person's truth. But it seems to me from what you're saying, in part our ability to figure out what to do about this depends on access to a lot more information that we're currently being deprived by the platforms. Has there been any discussion of which you're aware of ways in which the state could obligate them to make data available, data that they have?
One of the 9 objectives in the EU communication was access to researchers and independent fact checkers. That's not been honored by the platforms. So right now, what you have out of Facebook is something called Scholar, social science, Scholar One, and other initiatives, which is kind of a privileged. Facebook will make a cleaned data set available. It's not the raw data. So they will make a data set available with certain, data attributes table, and you can write applications. There is a esteemed body, consisting of elite private universities mostly, and some public universities. And these esteemed colleagues of yours will decide whether you'll get a grant or not. This is not how epidemiological research works, by the way. Right. If you want to study cancer, you're a PhD student at a lowly university, in the middle of flyover states, you can study, and in Europe, it's even better, right? Better access. So it's not fair and fair access to scientific community. So right now you have privileged access or tiered access, and this is something
largely controlled by the platforms themselves.
Yes, and you get all kinds of, you get the GDPR argument in Europe. oh, we can't share this data with you because it violates GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is, a whole, I can sell you the Taj Mahal if you want to believe that. And then there is, so they make that argument in Europe, and here it's also kind of a trade secret intellectual property argument, right, which is hard to.
But there's still such a disconnect between the popular sense, there's a real problem here, and the politician's sense of it, and yet the inability to put constraints or obligations on the platforms that would allow an exploration of these questions. And the solution seems to be more, well, we'll outsource to them finding a solution to these problems, which puts into a black box a regulation of our expression, all sorts of rights, which for hundreds of years we've protected through the state, now being sort of given away in a time when, the last survey I saw suggested 70% of Canadians and Americans get some or all of their news through social media. It's really been privatized in lots of ways, and then we're saying, well, we have these problems, and so we'll have the privatizers be the ones who are going to have to solve the problem within some broad guidelines we've given.
Well, I'd want to see that broken out a little bit.
Okay.
Because, many people, for example, may get their news by clicking on links and sort of embedded content in Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still traditional, that's NPR, puts up a clip or whatever. So, I've seen that, that statistic, and I know sometimes it's even specific to Facebook, but we have to remember, there's lots of traditional media that is on social media.
But the problem is what I get, I remember at an earlier panel we had the head of digital media for the CBC, and he told an interesting story. He said his neighbor, a next door neighbor, who'd been very critical of their website and critical of the position CBC was taking. About 6 months later, he ran into her and she said, I don't know what you've been doing, but CBC has gotten wonderful now. It's such a change. And he said, oh, have you been spending a lot of time on our website? And she said, no, I get it all through Facebook. And she was totally oblivious that the Facebook algorithm directs to her content from the CBC that she's likely to like, right? So it's true that we get stuff from news media and so forth, but it's been filtered by algorithms. So it's not us, it's not we pick up the Globe and Mail and choose what stories to read, or in the old days would watch CTV or CBC, which is all we could get, and you get whatever they put forward. It's you have algorithms that have enough of a profile of you to feed you what it thinks going to keep you on their site and keep you interested.
Well, I guess here I'll throw out my next provocative claim, which is just I often see reference to this, golden age of journalism, as if journalism itself is not incredibly curated and really molded to not in as sophisticated a way, but I think we should just be very clear that a lot of the news we get from no matter what source is highly curated and highly.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And one of the things of the history of journalism and of the likes in the United States of William Randolph Hearst or Rupert Murdoch or Conrad Black, but it wasn't targeted to us. In other words, they weren't able, I'm sure they would have liked to have been able
that's right.
but they weren't able to know what Jim Turk likes and what Jim Turk reads and to channel all the news to Jim Turk that they think, based on their knowledge of me, which it would be incredible, what I can see, and then I don't see anything else. So we create these filter bubbles and the things that have been talked about. I think that's what's different. I don't think that the old journalists were good actors in that sense, but they didn't have the capabilities or the information about us to allow them to do what's being done today.
I would only point out that, the point was made earlier that engagement can be achieved by giving people what they want, but it also can be achieved by giving people things that might, push against their beliefs. So it's not necessarily the case that even if something is going to be directed to you based on whatever algorithm is sorting through your preferences, that's necessarily going to always be confirming your pre-existing biases. At least if you accept the model for which the micro-targeting or the objectives for which micro-targeting is engaged in. Like
Well, I mean,
they just want to get you.
They want to
wanna
keep you
get
on
a
their site.
reaction.
Well,
Yeah.
no, I don't think it's not so much they want to get a reaction, they want to keep you on their site. And so by targeting you with things that either get you enraged or excited or some emotion, they're more likely to keep you on their site. But there's been so much research talking about filter bubbles, and so you can go through your whole life, if you're conservative, watching Fox News, getting your feeds via Facebook or otherwise from Breitbart and so forth. I mean, it is a challenge. Well, we need to bring the audience into this. What are your thoughts about any of this? Yes, Huli. Now, all of our events are video podcasts, so this will be up on our website tomorrow. And so we ask each of you, when you speak to signal Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, we'll bring around a microphone. And so if you could speak into the microphone.
Okay, thank you. I'm Huli McLaughlin. I have a question for Carissima. You seem to indicate at a moment a little while ago that we should be thinking about the positive qualities of some of these social media providers and so forth. In keeping that in mind, what would be wrong, in your opinion, with understanding that to expect governments to control the social media is equivalent to having another group which is separated from the public in large part? I know that we elect people, but nevertheless, we have a bureaucracy that's been created for a long time, and it's a culture we've created over long periods of time. But to expect that that culture that we've created that sets in governance would be able to control a fast-changing, wily industry, and more than industry, really cultural inventor, that we're also part of. And what's to say that it isn't perhaps more in keeping with our need for freedom of expression to allow that to continue and to not in any way invoke control from the government? Because in so doing, we could be destroying the very vitality of what is becoming a very powerful and meaningful vehicle and tool that we all use.
So if I gave the impression of not agreeing with that, I didn't mean to. My argument has been that the current attempts in the North American context, but also sometimes in the Anglo-American context, if you will, to put expectations on the platforms is flawed because you are putting public interest expectations on platforms that are just not set up to do that, and it's an abdication of responsibility. To be clear, I don't think the state should do that either, but my argument is it would be more honest for the state to say, in fact, we think this is a serious enough problem that we are going to have to step into court. I don't think that that's a good idea, and I think it would run into profound constitutional problems. But what I've been what I've written in this paper that James referenced at the very beginning is that I'm also irritated at the idea that the states will bring the tech companies to heel as if that's possible, and B, as if they're actually doing something instead of, in my opinion, just sort of abdicating responsibility. So I think, if you were to ask me, bad regulation versus no regulation, I would say minimal regulation.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is regarding the financial incentive causing aggressive censorship on platforms. In a non-Western context, like Facebook, Twitter, those platforms operate on countries like in Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, and in many cases, those governments in those states would like pay Facebook or pay Twitter to remove certain contents that's politically sensitive in that region and usually cause detrimental effects, and those platforms do comply with those governments to deleting politically sensitive items from their platform, and how should we deal with those? Because those type of censorship will cause like more harm, especially harm to human rights, like direct cause of death and torture in some cases. Like those are more like direct and obvious effects compared to what's happening in the West. So how do we deal with that?
I'm not sure I completely understand.
Well, let me begin and see if I've.
Yeah, I mean, I got sort of some
Yeah.
of the, but yeah, why don't you go ahead?
So, I mean, think of Myanmar.
Right.
And the use of social media to ramp up the attacks on the Rohingya, to justify them, and so forth. The problem with a minimal or no regulation approach is it's quite transparent, the harm that's being done in cases like that. Or, I mean, there's examples in Nigeria promoting intergroup conflict that has had lethal consequences.
Right.
How do we deal with that, and who deals with that? I don't know if that's getting at the question you're asking. So I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think maybe in the Indian context, every time there is a sensitive court decision or something that could be of concern for public law and order, safety, right? The Indian government, in its infinite wisdom, can ask or mandate the tech platforms to censor certain kinds of content. In the case of, I think, recently for WhatsApp, for the Brazilian election, and also in the Indian case, they had to limit the bulk forward to 5 to stop the viral spread of messages, right? Because if you have 1,000, 1,500 contacts, WhatsApp groups, an average of 10, 20, you can quickly amplify a rumor or falsehood, and they wanted to limit that to 5. Why 5? 5 is an arbitrary number, but that's something that that has been forced, on the platforms, so we have a few cases like that. Recently, India had a highly sensitive court decision about, where a disputed religious territory and SMS services and bulk SMS services and WhatsApp have been controlled, a few days before and few days after that verdict. Those seem to be ad hoc initiatives, and there the government again is arguing, but again, I don't know about other, other countries, other jurisdictions, or regimes. But at least in the Indian context, it seems to be, we are too big. You can ignore us at your own peril, right? So it's a very large market, and if WhatsApp doesn't, Facebook, the owner of WhatsApp doesn't do what is requested, then maybe they're looking at a similar situation like in China, right? Where they might be forced out, and local competitor might step in, maybe of poor quality. But again, here I think the thing is, it's the government. It's an elected government, so maybe they have, they have legitimacy and other things. But it's something that is requested, and then suddenly magic will happen from a technical standpoint. Suddenly you're able to do things that might not be technically possible to do in the Western context, right? Because WhatsApp in India is completely different to WhatsApp in the US or Canada, and you're willing to accommodate the government's requests in that scenario, right? Yeah. Even though it's not a law, it's just a directive, right, from the government. Yeah.
Well, and we do have crimes against promoting genocide and so forth that can be brought to bear, and we know that the platforms already exercise a fair bit of editorial control over things like child pornography and so forth. So I think that the Myanmar situation is different, and I think a very bad situation. But so we have the tools, but they're meant to apply in the Canadian context to very extreme forms of expression. And when you get to the margins, you know, just intolerant expression, for example, I think the legal answer would be that's probably in a gray zone and is not, you know, per se unlawful.
But let me press you on that. So you had mentioned earlier how Twitter has been somewhat more aggressive in eliminating a variety of things that are seen to be hateful or seen to be discriminatory or the will.
Not unlawful.
But
Just
not unlawful.
Twitter just decides.
No,
that
what
it's
I'm
not,
saying is,
yeah,
so in fact, Twitter is imposing
its own
restrictions.
That's right.
That the Canadian government couldn't impose because it would be a violation of the charter.
Yes.
Right?
Well, they'd
Theoretically.
be taking a risk.
They'd be taking a risk.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there are things that fall under the Facebook or Twitter notion of hate speech that would not be considered
right.
hate speech under Canadian law.
That's right.
Now, does that not pose a dilemma that this means of, really essential means of public communication, which the social media have become in our society, are able to restrict expression in a way that we as a society don't allow our government to restrict?
Yes, but I don't think realistically the state can do anything about that. I think that has to be really a site for pressure,
Okay.
for commercial and public pressure, to get Twitter to either reverse a particular decision that is seen as unfair, or to through public input, and they do allow.
Well, do you remember the case when I think it was Facebook was trying to deal with child pornography, and so they had a rule that you couldn't show a young person naked.
Yep.
And one of the things that got pulled was one of the most important photographs of all time that helped turn the tide of North American support for the American involvement in the Vietnam War, of this young 12-year-old girl running, being napalmed and naked and covered. And that got pulled under some notion of child porn. And so there was a huge fight back against that, and they had to put it back up. So, I mean, in some ways they are responsive, but we have no sense, I mean, because they have to provide us with no information about the nature of their algorithm and how they actually apply these guidelines, it's really hard to have a sense of how we could respond to an overbroad limitation on expression.
Well, and in many cases, I mean, it is, at least at the appeal level, it is subject to, there will be human eyes on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have an issue of who are they hiring and where are they located, and do they have the same cultural understandings that we do, and even just understanding certain words and irony and satire.
Well, but also when you think of, they have to do this in a constricted time frame with hundreds of millions of posts. I mean, I just think of our courts in defining what's hate speech under human rights law. The last one of the last major cases was Whatcott, this Pentecostal, as you know, Pentecostal homophobic preacher in Saskatchewan who wrote 4 pamphlets and went before the Saskatchewan Human Rights Tribunal. All 4 were found to be a violation of Saskatchewan's Human Rights Code. It goes to the Court of Appeal, which finds none of them are, and then it goes to the Supreme Court that finds 2 of them are.
Yeah.
So it took years for this factual to be sorted out, and we're asking Facebook or Twitter or whoever is monitoring these stuff to do it almost instantaneously
For thousands of examples.
for millions of
I mean,
examples.
you can count on 2 hands the number of hate speech, hate propaganda cases in Canada over the last.
So, yeah, I mean, the difficulty in translating the guidelines as to what constitutes hate speech, vilification and detestation, into what corresponds is extraordinarily difficult, and yet we're expecting the social media platforms to be able to do this millions of times a day in hundreds of languages, and that just worries me. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, you have to get Ange's attention, not mine. She has the microphone, I don't.
Hi, I was just going to address the question that the young lady up front was asking. Sorry, I'm Philip. I'm also the co-director of the Ryerson Social Media Lab. So we're one of the research lab here that actually have privileged information and data from Facebook, for example. But the question about what do you do about these platforms in countries that they operate in but don't follow the same rules of operation that we do here in the West? At the end of the day, these are private platforms. For example, Google decided to pull out of China because they were not willing to censor back then. Now they might be. The new people who are running it might be willing to go back. But at the end of the day, it's up to them to decide. They have to follow the laws of the country that they operate in. We might not agree with the government that's running that country, but if they're going to operate in that country, like if they want to be in India, if the Indian government says jump, they're going to say, how high would you like me to jump? And if that market is not big enough, they can choose to leave. But if they want to stay because the market is big enough, there's enough advertiser, guess what? They're going to jump, and often. And here in the West, because we have a strong tradition of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, our government has been basically unwilling and unable to move. At the same time, for example, at our lab, we see the harm that these posts can cause. From every election, you can see the type of posts that people post. Like, for example, right now we're conducting, in the last election, we capture every single post from every single member of parliament and every single candidate to analyze the kind of conversation that people were having with the candidates running for office in Canada. And we want to see whether men politicians versus women politicians who are running, or candidates who are running, were getting different types of harassment and what kind. Because there's a notion out there right now in Canada that women politicians seem to be beaten up upon more often online and more harshly. And so we decided, okay, let's get every piece of data on every member of parliament, on every candidate, and compare. We're about to release that report soon. Because, again, the popular notion out there is that they're ganging up on women politicians.
You're going to give us a clue as to what you're going to report soon? I know you don't want to scoop yourself.
In a few more weeks. Okay. But some really interesting notion, but I can't get over the fact that these are still private platforms. Just like in this room, there's somebody deciding who's going to get this microphone right now. She just gave it to me. Right? So, I mean, what do we do about that? And that's why I came to this discussion, and I'm hoping to hear more about what are workable regulations. Because right now, all I hear is, well, they can't do anything because freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But at the same time, these platforms are introducing things that were not available in our society before. The level and the granularity at which they can dissect the data is unprecedented. In the old days, magazines can, let's say, put out a high net worth magazine that's directed to a high net worth individual. So they know that only high net worth individuals would be buying that. So the Mercedes would know to advertise in that magazine because people who are not high net worth might not want to buy Mercedes, and so on and so forth. But now, because they know each and every person's desires, the joke at the lab we always say is, Facebook knows what you do when you're with your friends. Google knows what you do when you're alone. But together, they know a little bit about everything that you do, so they can serve up ads that advertisers are willing to pay for because they can see the result of the business that they get because of the ad they place. So there is a fundamental change. They have changed something, because James, you made a comment earlier about how it's not new, but actually they have brought something really new and unique. It's that level of granularity.
That's what's new.
Okay, that we've never as a species have been able to access before. I can now find out, hi, show this ad only to female college graduate who lives in the 416 area code. Hi, only show this to people who are 65 and over. Like during the election, we were watching the type of ads that the different parties were placing based upon where you live in Canada during the French debates, for example. So you didn't have to waste your money showing that ad to women, for example, in Ontario, because they're not watching the French debate. Anyway, like I said, I would love to hear from the panelists as to what are some possible type of restrictions and regulations that might be workable within the context of our society.
Well, that's the rub. So I want to just, and I'll leave it brief because I want to hear from other persons in the audience. I think we have to be careful not to be conflating aspects of our digital age. So we have the platforms, and you have talked about what should be a really interesting study you're releasing about looking at the nature of the interactions between people running to be members of parliament and their constituents, some of whom are presumably highly abusive and misogynistic or racist and so on. That's one thing, but then we're getting back to the micro-targeting. And those raise different kinds of issues. So some things we might want to think about, people aren't going to like them, remove anonymity, right? Got to post under your own name, and then you can have social consequences from that. You can remove the ad-based model of how they make their money. Then you will have a very different financial reality in terms of how people are able to access these platforms and get the same kind of efficiencies and services and capabilities that they do now. And the final one is this is actually not realistic, even less realistic, you have some sort of model of prior restraint. So there's a delay. You post something and it's vetted and then it goes up, which of course completely destroys the live communicative aspect of some of these platforms, not all of them, right? There's sort of some of the platforms which it wouldn't be an issue, but for a number of the platforms, I mean, that's ultimately what real control would look like, I think.
And there have been more specific kinds of suggestions. In the American context, there's a professor of law now at Boston Law School, Daniel Citron, who was looking for Danielle. Did I say Daniel? Danielle, who was looking specifically at cyberbullying, cyber harassment, had a number of suggestions, such as on the criminal law front, she wrote, harassment and stalking laws could be updated to reach the totality of abuse, and revenge porn should be banned. Civil rights law should penalize online harassers who interfere with someone's right to pursue life's crucial opportunities of work, education, and self-expression. She strongly opposes getting rid of anonymity because of what that would mean for people who live in totalitarian states or people who are subject to domestic abuse, or there's a variety of reasons, but does talk about opening the door to more pseudonymous litigation to be permitted so that victims can pursue redress under the law without drawing attention to the harassment. So there are a number of suggestions of very specific things that could be considered as a way of doing it. And I think that's I mean, in our legal context, hers is written in the American context, and so there are differences. But as Carissima was suggesting, with each of these suggestions, there's a downside as well as an upside. And it's how we as a society want to balance these things. I don't know, Ravi, if you have any other comments and answers to that question.
As I said before, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel or even start on a blank slate. The state apparatus has a lot of experience, for good or worse, with regulation and across different industry sectors, and some of that could be could follow, right? I think it's a bit like, if Uber says, we are just an app, we are just a technology platform, but if you look like a taxi company and you act like a taxi company, then you are a taxi company, and that has been invoked in some countries, right? Like in Denmark and other countries, they refused to operate because the Danish government said, yeah, I mean, for us, you're a taxi company, and Uber says, no, we are an app. No, you're a taxi company. At some point, this becomes a Monty Python sketch, right? And then Uber decides to leave. Even in the pharma sector, there's quite a lot of self-regulation in Europe, because the thin line between patient communication and product promotion or marketing, it's a very thin line in Europe, whereas in the US in particular, it's a football field, right? I mean, you can do whatever you want in many. Of course, I'm joking. So in particularly in the Nordic countries, what happens most of Europe and particularly in Nordic countries is almost every single corporate social media post on the official Facebook wall of, let's say, Novo Nordisk has to pass legal. because legal has to sign off that this is patient communication and it's not really promoting insulin or some such. So what might happen? I cannot speak for North America, but the little that I know with the European context, what might happen one way if the self-regulation effort fails in Europe, which I would put my, if I'm a betting person, I would place my bets there. The evaluation report is going to come out. And then maybe there's a co-regulation model that is possible. It's done in some other sectors, or a horizontal or vertical sectorial regulation. And there are many paradigms available, right? There is a European regulatory agency for broadcasters. There are, what happens on public or private broadcasters is heavily regulated, and that law might just apply. So just like Uber being a taxi company and Airbnb being a hotel, in the hospitality business, if it is deemed that Facebook is in the broadcasting business or Twitter, then that law will apply for whatever the cost is. And then the technical argument that it's in 400 different languages, millions of pieces of content. That's I personally do not have any sympathy for that argument, because if you can identify 10,000 objects in a given Facebook picture, you can deal with millions of or it's a cost. It's a cost. It's a business cost of compliance. Pharmaceutical industry, offload it, find it in your, come up with business model innovation, and why is your CEO paid billion trillion kronas? They better earn the or CFO. So I think it's the technical cop-out that it's too big might then get you into the anti-competition realm, right? If you claim that this is we are too big for our own good, we cannot police ourselves, we cannot police the content. It's too big, it's humongous, we can't deal with it, and then maybe it's a good time to break you up, to help you manage the overload of data that you are dealing with. And by the way, you don't pay any taxes, at least in some, in many parts of the world. So, so there might be very little sympathy, but of course, there is a lot of, we cannot discount the, I think in the end it comes down to whether tech innovation is like financial innovation or medical innovation or other kinds of innovation. So what is it? What is the value of tech innovation? I'm not an expert in it, but that's, I think, a question that we need to, because the financial innovation question, I think we are not as happy as we are 20, 30 years back. Maybe not. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ange, did you see?
Thank you both for your really insightful talks. I'm curious about the lack of evidence, the lack of data, and the assumptions that we make despite the fact that we don't have the evidence, and the assumptions about harm. The whole notion of what is harm, I find quite troubling, particularly around the elections issues and who is manipulating data, who's telling us things that aren't true, and whether that in fact has any effect on the voter. We don't have the data, yet we clearly are making assumptions. You recall that when it was determined that it was Russia that had interfered in the previous U.S. election, the immediate response is, but it didn't make any difference, right? But no one gave us any data to show whether it made any difference or it didn't make any difference. So how are we supposed to know? Many years ago, when kids started playing video games, the assumption was that if kids played video games, they would be far more likely to be violent. And everybody believed that violence was being caused by video games, and that video games, clearly, there was not just a correlation, but a causation. And when people started actually collecting data, it was nonsense. There was really no correlation at all that made sense. And yet there is still that assumption. If you ask people, what causes violence, or it's hip hop music. Clearly, hip hop music causes people to be shot. And how is it that we can get the information that will convince people, when if you look at the current, craziness with information, particularly in the United States right now, nobody's being convinced by anything other than what they previously believed. So why are we so worried? I understand, and Carissima, the notion of using something other than the criminal courts to deal with harassment. We have civil libel and we have criminal libel. Criminal libel is ridiculous. Shouldn't, in my opinion, it makes no sense. But, are there other ways of dealing with, our assumption that things are causing harm when we have no proof that they really are? And I'd like to start with Ravi on that question.
So I think what you raise, I think to stop being provocative and to add proper academic nuance, I think what I would say is we have quite a lot of published research on the impact of disinformation on the public sphere, and also quite a bit on electoral outcomes and so on and so forth. What we are lacking is full access to data, and we are no way. We are not like climate science, or we are not like epidemiology research, right? That's that's a problem. We do not have, or even like economics research, where you have data sets, very well instrumented data sets that multiple research teams can verify, replicate studies. For example, replicating a social media study these days is, I don't know how many of the findings have been replicated because you don't have access to data. Even then, the scripts and other things might be different. So that said, So that creates a problem when we look at what should we do about it, right? If you take climate science as an example, that's there might be a clear scientific consensus on the phenomena, but we are having public policy problems, for lack of will, ideological. But in this case, we do not have we do not have the scientific consensus. But there is quite a lot of public discourse because some electoral outcomes, to be quite frank, are not to the liking, of many of us or some of us in this room and or elsewhere. And there needs to be something, we need to do something something about it. So how will you make public policy, forget regulation, even public policy, in the absence of clear scientific evidence? That's going to be a challenge. And if you're going to actually find out that it's an inconvenient truth, like video games, also in something provocatively in women's studies, there is something like the Nordic paradox. Why do these Nordic societies, which are the most egalitarian societies on the planet, keep producing very few women in STEM disciplines, very few professors? Denmark has the world's second lowest number of female professors. Really? Japan is number 1. I think we are number 2. We used to be. I'm no longer a Dane. But you wouldn't expect that. You wouldn't, and very few engineers, very few, science, technology, engineering, and math. And Norway had to make a law of 1/3, female representation on corporate boards, right? And so on and so forth. But whereas India and Iran have no problems producing millions, right? In many cases of STEM graduates, and there are no way, nobody would accuse them of being egalitarian, in the wildest of dreams. So I think we have so maybe the long, I will close it with, there is a component here, there is a public education component here, definitely, right? And what you're also indicating is we seem to be very, we don't change our ideological priors. Right? Many are willing to believe that Trump would have said that, right? If I want to run as a politician, I would run as a Republican because they're the dumbest people, because that confirms your, that liberal ideological prior, but that's a false, that's a fake news. As Hillary Clinton's campaign manager is a virgin, blood-drinking, Satanist equally. But I think those ideological priors, I think, are getting us into a lot of trouble. And what social media might be doing is that filter bubble, right? It keeps you warm and cozy in that ideological bubble, and then you have the larger ecosystem of Fox News or whatever, or whatever the equivalent of it, if there is really one on the liberal side, right? And we are not willing to change the ideological prior, in light of new evidence, because if there is no evidence that you're willing to. So what would it take for climate science evidence to convince, if you are on the right of the spectrum or far right of the spectrum, what would it take a person to convince you of that this is a real phenomenon? I don't know.
Carissima, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to maybe move a bit from the empirical part of the question to the political part of the question. So whether we talk about disinformation, misinformation, they can kind of be used interchangeably. They probably shouldn't. I think we also need to be honest about the fact that it's not just coming from Russian troll farms. It's coming from people in positions of political leadership, right? And we've seen there's many examples. A couple of years ago, people might have heard of something called the UN Global Compact on Migration, which was just basically a statement of best principles about how to deal with migration. And we had actual, members of parliament saying that this was a ceding of Canadian sovereignty and would essentially misleading the public on that. And it makes, makes us very uncomfortable. It certainly makes the media uncomfortable to use terms like, this is just false or a lie, and instead they, are quite happy to report on it because that's news, and then to interview whoever it is, and then that gets amplified. So, I heard that one of the reasons that the issue of white supremacy was really touchy for many of the social platforms, as opposed to, say, Islamic radicalism, jihad, is that some of the markers of white supremacy would be difficult to differentiate by some of the political rhetoric employed by certain conservative politicians in the United States. And so for outfits like Twitter and Facebook, that was radioactive. Like, they wouldn't get involved. So, I guess I fear I'm in the position of the doom and gloom person, but I think we just also need to realize the sort of the political ecosystem that we're operating in too, and how media responds to various incentives, and also is very much motivated to keep the public engaged.
If I could just add one thing before we go to the back. Sophia Rosenfeld, whose book, Democracy and Truth, I had mentioned earlier, spends a lot of time talking about what we're discussing now is also a very old issue, and that is the contest in democratic society between expert and popular knowledge. And it's always been contested. There's no evidence that when it's completely expert domination that it works better. And it's always the contest between those two, and we're, occasionally it really bursts onto the scene as it is now. But it's a fundamental issue in a democratic society, because if the populace cedes to a group of experts based on science who rule, you don't really have a democratic society anymore. And on the other hand, if you totally disdain any notion of expertise, you also have a huge problem. And so this tension that we're experiencing acutely at the moment, in fact, has been a characteristic of democratic society from the beginning. But we often lose sight of that, she points out, I think accurately, and think somehow these are issues as a result of social media or something that's unique in the present moment. And we're not going to solve them unless we understand them historically. Anyways, enough of a plug for that.
So my name's Paul Knox. I'm retired from the School of Journalism here, and I've also been active for the last 20 years in an organization called Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, which tries to promote free expression for everybody, but particularly as it affects the ability of journalists to do their jobs. It seems to me, and my question is very disingenuous, it's, what do you think of what I'm about to say?
At least you're honest.
So it seems we often hear that, or we often hear it said that the social media platforms are not real life. People try to remind us that they're not real life, and we have this abbreviation IRL, which actually stands for in real life. I personally think that needs to be pushed back against, because I think when you have a world in which 2.5 billion people have Facebook accounts, and people spend 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day on social media platforms, one or the other, we're way beyond the point where we can talk about this not being real life. It is occupying an awful lot of people's time, and for many people, social media really is a big part of where they live their lives, how they connect with people, how they see themselves as human beings in terms of their, at least as far as their relationship with other people is concerned. That being the case, and also being the case that large platform companies do their business by occupying public space, in other words, by availing themselves of public infrastructure. They use spectrum, they use wires, they use electricity, and other aspects of public infrastructure to carry on their business. And they also, they aim, and to a large extent in their areas, such as search in terms of Google, such as personal networking in terms of Facebook and so on. They really have, they aspire to monopoly, like all good capitalist businesses do, even though they say that they are in favor of competition in the beginning. They aspire at least to monopoly, if not, and sometimes to oligopoly. They'll make that as a concession. All that being the case, it seems to me that we have a very good claim for saying that this is public space, part of the public sphere, and there's absolutely no reason why, as a society, we should not be involved in trying to make it work for everybody and work for the general good and the public interest. Many of the issues that are raised involve various kinds of harm. And it seems to me they fall into two groups. One is personal harm directed at individuals, and one is a more general harm that injures the interests of society as a whole. As far as the first is concerned, it seems to me that harm directed at individuals, whether it's physical harm, whether it's cyber harm, so on, really falls within the ambit of the criminal law. We have criminal law. We have a criminal code that has offenses such as harassment, such as watching and besetting, such as, and of course, hate speech laws. But even beyond hate speech, even before we get to hate speech, we have laws that say that you cannot sit in front of somebody's home with an arsenal of machine guns and a bunch of signs saying that the person who occupies the home or who owns it can be described by a number of hateful characteristics. I mean, you cannot do that. The police will go and remove you and stop you from doing that. There are ample parallels to that we see every day in terms of what happens online, what happens directed at individuals online, this kind of hateful stuff that we've been talking about, that we know is directed toward individuals, women more than men, possibly marginalized people from marginalized communities rather than others. And it seems to me that what we need to do is tell the police to do their jobs, and if the police don't have the laws that they need to stop that kind of thing, we simply need to give them those laws. And I, as a ardent defender of freedom of expression, I have no problem with that. That person sitting outside of somebody's house with an arsenal of machine guns, spewing hate directed at the person who involves, that's not freedom of expression. That is not protected speech in any way. It's harassment, vilification of a single individual, and it's totally outside the bounds of what we need to accept as conduct in our society. So that's the individual harm. The second thing is the societal harm. And it seems to me, again, as a lifelong defender of freedom of expression, as a journalist who's availed myself of many of the freedoms that are, kind of subunits of freedom of expression, I have absolutely no problem with saying there is some way that we have to prevent platforms that are as big and as powerful and occupy as much of the public sphere as these ones do from hijacking public discussion and from hijacking public discussion for commercial ends, for profit, effectively. And the way that's being done is it's not just that algorithms aggregate news and present it in a certain way. It's that they do so specifically with the goal of being able to turn around and take the interaction that people have with that stolen or borrowed or purchased news, certainly not generated by the platforms in any way. Another way they don't qualify as, using it as making protected speech. They specifically make use of this stuff so that they can get people to interact with it, generating more data that way, and then turning around and not only agreeing to direct certain kinds of news toward people for the purpose of keeping them engaged so that they will see more of the kind of ads that their advertisers want them to see, but also so that they will generate more and more data with each interaction, data that can be packaged and resold all over the place, again, for commercial gain. Supposedly, this is all consensually provided, this data, because people, maybe scan the terms of service, maybe they don't. Anyway, they click on I agree, and that's the end of that. It's not anything that anybody would really, on examination, describe as informed consent. And I have no problem whatsoever with regulating and setting parameters for that activity, for the activity of aggregating news, taking it from all kinds of sources, purchased, stolen, borrowed, whatever, and using it for that purpose. What does that lead to? And I think Professor Citron down in Massachusetts has written about this. It leads to regulating the algorithms. It leads to controlling what kind of algorithmic activity these platforms are able, again, in our public sphere, using our public infrastructure to use to control and distribute, to control the distribution of news to individuals, to the vast majority now of our citizens in this country. And to me, that's the thing we have to agree on. I'm not an expert on, I don't know anything about how you build algorithms, but what I do know is that it should be possible to agree on the fact that they have to be given some parameters, just like railways. When railways are built, they have to be built according to certain specifications, which are in regulations, just like banks have to operate with certain restrictions. They can't. There are certain things they can't do, and we pass laws about that, and we regulate, and we pass regulations under those laws. So my question is, why can we simply not? And again, this to me doesn't impinge on freedom of speech whatsoever, especially because these platforms are not actually going out and getting the news and behaving as news organizations at all. Why can we simply not agree to do that and then, get expertise to bear on how it can be done and take it from there?
Do you have a
Seems
quick
to me this is
response?
quite simple.
Quick response?
Well, it's not just news. Google News is not monetized. They direct the user back to the whatever website. And these platforms are very different. They're very different. They're doing different things. So we can't sort of analogize them all one to the other.
But to the more general point, I mean, he's arguing that we regulate virtually every other industry. Can we regulate
Well, sure, we can regulate. I mean,
Okay.
we can regulate anything. But I think the kind of control that's being discussed is actually the state taking over the infrastructure on the argument that, in fact, the state has built the infrastructure
Right.
that makes this possible, so it should just take it on. Because I don't, and if that's what is being talked about, then that
But I think Paul was
carries an
drawing an
entire-
analogy to railroads or banks where they actually don't take over the infrastructure, but they highly regulate it.
Well, when you're talking about regulations that will inevitably force certain decisions around content and that are being taken with the goal of having an effect on content, because the
Yep.
particular thing was talked about was news, but we're talking about all kinds of other
Right,
things.
yep.
That gets you into the freedom of expression framework, and you can't get away from that by saying, but it's a private company. We're just giving them.
Ravi, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think it's not, some countries have, maybe not so much for social media. For example, in Denmark, if you want to register a domain of DK, the country level domain for Denmark as a private entity, it's tied to the equivalent of your social insurance number, the CPR number of Denmark. You cannot do it because there is a KYC, know your customer, policy. It's not problematic in the Danish context or the Nordic context because there's a high level of trust in government. The Nordics have, there's a very high level of trust in the government, so it's not anti-intellectual, anti-government like in other parts of the world. So that's so maybe a KYC requirement for know your customer requirement for social media, at least in some, if not across the board, could be something that can be done if algorithms are.
But that might be a problem in
Yeah.
Iran or Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so if you don't trust the government, why would you trust a private company with but in other parts of the world, like in Norway, for example, it's the banks that manage your digital identity. The state identity, it's called bank ID. For some reason, who is an authentic person is left to the banks in the Norwegian context. So you log with bank ID for your tax, right? Which has nothing to do with a private bank, issuing, but the private bank is in charge of managing your public credentials, right? Which you use to log into government services, like healthcare, insurance, and tax. But that works in that context because there's a high level of trust in those societies.
Okay, we have.
I would also just point out that unlike the other industries that have been cited, they're not just providing a service in this straight commercial transaction. They're providing a platform in which people generate and access content that's at a very personal level and that has a different kind of value. And in fact, we don't regulate those kinds of cultural content industries in the same way that we regulate just more basic
service industry.
commercial and service industries.
Yeah, because we are not a customer, right? A typical user, the customer is the advertiser.
Right.
The customer for Facebook is not the user. The user is more or less the product, but not the customer.
Okay, we have time for 2 quick questions, and I think, go ahead.
Just a comment on Google and China, that Google was actually censoring their services in China before they pulled out. That was not why they pulled out. They pulled out of China because China was hacking their servers. That's all.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. And final comment or question?
Okay, maybe you can wrap your head around. If you follow all this propaganda about coronavirus, you're going to end up taking a vaccine, which is all the mouthpieces from the White House or Department of Health or the World Health Organization or the CDC. They're all, everything they say, then they punctuate it with, once we create a vaccine or come up with a vaccine, we'll all be safe. But if you look at the Georgia Guidestone #1 commandment, it says to depopulate the earth by 95%, but it says it in a positive way. So if the global elite are giving everybody just the common cold with all these, or respiratory illness with all these chemical trails that are hammering our cities and communities with by aircraft, look up chemtrails, there's tons of docs about that, you'll fall for that. And now like all the countries receiving their citizens back from China. Now everyone's
What is your question
quarantined.
for our panel?
Okay, let me. It's about propaganda because it's not only this coronavirus, but they got the World War III card that they're playing. And let me try to show it from a native point of view. I'm a part of the Mohawk Nation. Back during the first Persian diversion Gulf War I, they diverted the world's attention from the Oka crisis, which was the Iraq War rhymed with Iroquois, and that was over a golf course, Gulf War. And it all came out that CNN's propaganda about the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter crying. Oh,
But
please.
again, can I ask, what's your question for our panel?
Well, kind of comment on a mainstream and social media propaganda, because it's all about all that. Like, chaos is reigning on the planet. All these chaos cards are being played. World War III, Australia's burning down, and, pestilence, all this kind of stuff. So, like, somehow we got to put our good minds together. Can you, like, wrap your head around all this propaganda that's going on? Like, everything is, like, prophetic and of biblical proportions right now. We got to come together and put our good minds together about all this propaganda.
Okay.
Like, because you can't believe this, or you're going to end up depopulated with vaccines.
Do you have any, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I agree that it does sometimes feel like end times. I understand that, and it does feel like, again, just sort of screaming into the void, like, what does it all matter? And I do agree that we need to find ways to think positively and productively about these really intractable issues. And maybe I'll end by saying I do retain some small hope that we can do that.
Well, I want to thank all of you very much for coming, and I want to thank our panelists for a very important and valuable contribution. Thank you.